In 1975, Vietnam was turning. The North Vietnamese army was rapidly marching towards Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. Nixon had just resigned, and President Ford was in command. The American ground forces had already retreated, but a few thousand Americans had remained. They were now trapped in a city surrounded by the North Vietnamese. The sea lanes were blocked, planes couldn't land, and North Vietnam was ready to deliver its final blow. This is the Fall of Saigon with Hindsight. Saigon had largely escaped the wrath of war. It was a densely populated city with somewhere between 4 and 5 million inhabitants. But as the North Vietnamese army was rapidly advancing, hundreds of thousands had fled. The war had already lasted for 2 decades and had split the country in two. The communist forces of North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and the non-communist forces of South Vietnam, backed by the US and its allies. The United States had already begun to withdraw. In 1969, President Nixon wanted to shift the burden of war on the South Vietnamese forces. In 1973, the American troops were withdrawn altogether. The US was still providing financial and military support, but that would soon prove to be insufficient. In their words, South Vietnam is in deep trouble, and unless the present trends are reversed within the next few months, the very existence of an independent, non-communist South Vietnam will be at stake. This memo was written with such an alarming voice for a reason, because only days before, the North Vietnamese had broken through their defenses, and they were making a rapid advance towards Saigon. But those few months were an underestimate. Little over a month later, the North Vietnamese had surrounded the capital. This had caught everybody off guard. In the morning of April 29th, fighting broke out in the outskirts of the city. The Americans and their South Vietnamese allies were nervously awaiting instructions. They were told to listen to the radio of the armed forces, and around noon, they received a message. The radio played Bing Crosby's White Christmas on repeat, and this was the signal that Operation Frequent Wind was to be executed. In the absence of evacuation routes over land and without a secure flight line, the US government set in motion the largest helicopter evacuation in history. They had selected 13 pickup points around the city. They used smaller UH-1 Huey helicopters to land on the roofs of tall buildings, and the much larger CH-33 Sea Knights to land at the airport and on the embassy grounds. At 2 p.m., more than 2,000 evacuees had gathered at the US Defense Office. In the next hour, they carried out 18 flights, bringing about 1,000 people to US Navy ships in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, the US Embassy was getting crowded. Several thousand people had gathered, hoping to get a flight out of the country. This felt as their very last opportunity. The US sent the largest helicopters that they had at their disposal, flying people on and off with 10-minute intervals, and they continued doing so for hours. In the early morning of April 30th, the evacuation flights were still ongoing. But outside the US Embassy, an angry mob gathered and the mood was turning grim. At 3:30 a.m., President Ford authorized 19 more helicopter lifts, and all had to depart within the next 15 minutes. The US ambassador was instructed to depart on the last flight. But hours later, the evacuation flights were still ongoing. North Vietnamese started to occupy the buildings around the embassy, and small armed firefights were reported. And just 6 blocks away from the embassy, anti-aircraft weapons were installed. The US had to hurry. They continued their flights long after the deadline set by President Ford, and around 9 a.m. the mission was concluded. Over 7,000 Americans and South Vietnamese had been evacuated, and the city fell into the hands of North Vietnam. April 30th marked the end of the Vietnam War. Saigon fell into the hands of the communist North Vietnam and changed its name to Ho Chi Minh City. A year later, the North and the South merged into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The day that Saigon fell is remembered differently by different people. Western accounts often call it the Fall of Saigon. The Vietnamese government officially calls it the Day of Liberating the South for National Reunification, while many Vietnamese refugees refer to the day as the Day We Lost the Country, Black Friday, or the National Day of Resentment. Check out my video on how East Timor's oil and gas is being stolen by Australia by clicking on the suggested video on the left, or check out YouTube's suggestion here on the right, and I'll see you there.